Welcome to I Love Apes. My name is Eric Sampson, and what I want to do is help you get a 5 on your AP Environmental Science test. We're going to start off the year with Unit 1, Ecosystems, and this episode is our first. It's going to be on a concept called primary productivity. Pretty important basic concept for the year, so let's get started. So we'll start with this. Like all the energy that drives the processes on Earth basically comes to us from the sun. The only exception is plate tectonics, but everything else comes to us from the sun. Let's see how that works. So basically, energy leaves the sun in the form of light energy, and it travels through space and it arrives at Earth in the form of light. Well, when it hits Earth, what happens to it? Well, most of it gets absorbed. Here, let's go ahead and turn my laser. Most of it gets absorbed by the Earth's surface and converted into heat. Well, what happens then? It basically causes a process called convection, which makes the air move in these circular patterns. That ends up making wind, that ends up making weather. It drags the ocean surface with it, so that makes ocean currents. So you can see a lot of the Earth's processes that we're going to study this year are driven by this light energy arriving from the sun. But today we want to focus on something else. What else happens to this energy? Well, a small amount of it ends up being captured by green plants through their chloroplasts and converted into chemical potential energy. And that's what we want to focus on today, is that small portion of sunlight that ends up getting captured by plants. So green plants have this miraculous ability to store energy from the sun in this molecule called glucose. And I'm sure you studied this in biology, but we need to go over because it's so important. So they do this through a process called photosynthesis, which I am sure you've heard about. Still, got to work our way through it. So here's the idea. I've got this green leaf here. What's going to happen? First, the plant is going to take two low energy molecules. The first one's going to be carbon dioxide, and that's going to come into the leaf, and we're talking about terrestrial plants. So it's going to come into the leaf through the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide, the bonds between carbon and oxygen are very tight, and there's not a lot of energy in them. The plant will also bring in water. It brings it up to the roots. And this is, again, a very low energy molecule. There's not a lot of free energy here because these bonds between the hydrogen and oxygen are very strong. So they're difficult to break and release any energy from. But what the plant then does is it takes light energy and uses it to break these two molecules apart. So light energy comes in, and in the chloroplast, it's able to break the carbon dioxide and water apart. And once it's broken apart, it can rearrange them in a high energy molecule called glucose. So instead of the bonds existing between carbon and oxygen and hydrogen and oxygen, they're existing between carbon and carbon and carbon and hydrogen. Those bonds tend to have a lot of energy in them. That's the basic idea of photosynthesis. So we have this high energy molecule called glucose. I strongly suggest you memorize C6H12O6. It's pretty useful. So let's just look at the equation here. So I got carbon dioxide, and I'm going to react it with water, so plus H2O. Then we're going to bring in some sunlight. We'll use that sunlight to break these apart and rearrange them as a glucose molecule. But now let's go back to chemistry a little bit. Don't worry, you don't have to do this on the AP test, but I just want to point out, let's just do some stoichiometry here, okay? So let's just make a balanced chemical equation. I see I have 6 carbons here. Well, I've only got 1 over here, so I'm going to have 6 carbon dioxide molecules available to produce this. And I see I have 12 hydrogens. Well, water only has 2, so again, I'm going to need 6 of these in order to have 12 hydrogens. Great, now I've got enough carbon and hydrogen to build this, but if you notice, this only has 6 oxygens, and over here, I have a total of 12 plus 6, that's 18. So that means there's some leftover oxygen right here. So I have 18 oxygen here and 18 oxygen here. I just want to point out, it's not like plants are being nice to us by making oxygen. It's just a leftover substance in the process of formulating glucose. And that is then released into the atmosphere because the plant doesn't need it. Now, the process of photosynthesis captures light energy and stores it in glucose. But the thing is, why are the plants doing that? Well, they do that because they need energy available for cellular processes. All life forms need this. And so respiration is the process by which this energy is released. So don't think of respiration as the act of breathing. Think of it as the act of releasing chemical energy from glucose and converting it into metabolic energy that's necessary to run all the cellular processes that keep us alive. So it's really easy to remember the equation for respiration because it's just the opposite of photosynthesis, which, by the way, I strongly encourage you to memorize at least not the balance, but at least the basic chemical equation for photosynthesis, because this is just the opposite of it. So I'm going to take glucose, I'm going to react it with oxygen, and then this oxygen is going to break apart this molecule, releasing these high energy bonds, turning them into low energy bonds that releases metabolic energy, and we end up with carbon dioxide and water. So if you think about it, you eat things that contain this in one form or another. You breathe in oxygen in order to have it available to break this up, and at a cellular level it does so, and afterwards you have these two components left over, which you then breathe out. Now, here's the thing to think about, and this is kind of cool, and this is really important, and that is that every cell in every plant and animal on Earth must release energy from glucose every moment of every day. If they ever stop, they die right away. Well, plants got this problem, and it's this. They can only produce glucose through photosynthesis during the daylight hours. What happens when the sun goes down? Well, the sun can't engage in photosynthesis, but its cells still need to respire. They still need to release this energy. How are they going to manage this? Well, what happens is plants don't just eat glucose as it's made. They make a lot more glucose than they need, so that at night there's excess glucose stored in the plant that it can then use to respire and survive. Now, the term for capturing light energy and turning it into glucose is called primary productivity. And this is what we call the production of glucose by green plants. But the thing is, we needed to be very specific about two different aspects of it. One is called gross primary productivity, or GPP. And basically that's the total amount of glucose that the plant made in a given period of time. Let's say over the course of a day. It made a certain amount of glucose, which we could measure, say, in kilograms. But there's that. Okay. But the thing is, plants only consume, they say 30 to 60% of this. So basically half of it is uneaten. It's leftovers, if you want to think of it that way. And so what does it do with these leftovers? Well, it typically converts them into other carbon compounds like starches, cellulose, which is like a structural material that is used to build wood and stems, lipids, which are like oils. So these are high energy, non-sugar molecules, where glucose is a sugar, that the plant uses to store this excess energy. Now, net primary productivity, NPP, basically that's what we call this leftover energy that the plant didn't get around to eating. So gross primary productivity is the total amount of glucose the plant produced, and NPP is what's left over after the plant eats the amount of glucose that it needs. All right, and it's usually in the form of not glucose, but in starches and lipids and cellulose. So here's why NPP is important. It's because it results in the increase in the amount of carbon compounds that are in a plant, and that's what's available for everything else in the ecosystem to live off of. Now let's think about this. NPP means there's extra carbon compounds. Well, they have mass, and so what's going to happen is the plant is going to grow. Surprise, surprise, right? So as the plant grows, we call that added mass its NPP. Because if it ate all of its glucose that it produced, it wouldn't grow at all. But because there's extra leftovers, we have this added mass to the plant, which we're going to call NPP. And the reason this is worth pointing out is that the best way to measure NPP is in terms of biomass. So biomass is just basically the carbon compounds present in living organisms we refer to as biomass. It's basically take away the water because that doesn't have energy in it. Everything else is called biomass. So it is starches, cellulose, glucose, lipids, things like that. So biomass is really the most common and preferable way of measuring the NPP of an ecosystem. So let's just look at it mathematically. It's pretty straightforward. Okay, think about it this way. NPP, which is the leftovers, is equal to GPP, which is how much glucose the plant made, minus how much it ate or respired. So let's just look at an example here. So let's just say over the course of 24 hours, a tree produced 6 kilograms of glucose. That would be its GPP. And it consumed 2 kilograms of that glucose. That would be how much it respired. So you can already tell what the NPP is going to be. So I'm going to say 6 GPP minus 2 respiration, and that leaves me with 4 kilograms of biomass added to the plant every day, and that would be its NPP. And that's what's available for other organisms in the ecosystem to live off of, because nothing else other than plants can produce food. All right. Now, let's move forward here. Because NPP causes plants to gain biomass? Well, we're going to typically measure NPP in terms of kilograms per unit of time. A lot of times we'll do it not just in terms of kilograms per unit of time, but kilograms per unit area, because we're talking about a whole forest per unit of time. Now, we refer to plants as producers because they're the only organisms that can produce glucose, food, okay? And so they basically provide the chemical energy that supports every organism in an ecosystem. So all other non-plant organisms are entirely dependent on these plants to produce the food that they're going to live off of. So since NPP is the amount of available energy for everything else to live off of, it basically places limits on the amount of biomass you can have in the other non-plant organisms in an ecosystem. So NPP is important because it limits how much life can be in a given area. So basically, if I have more NPP, that means I have more food. That means I can have more animal biomass, say like in a rainforest. And we're going to see later in this unit actually, or maybe next unit, that also leads to more biodiversity, more different species. Whereas less NPP means there's going to be less food, and that means there's less animal biomass like you'd have in a desert, and that means you're going to have less biodiversity. So let's look at a rainforest here. Okay, so a rainforest has a high NPP, right? There's a lot of primary productivity that's happening there. So it can support a lot of animal biomass and a lot of biodiversity. Whereas a desert, you can see there's not a lot of plants here because there's limits on how much photosynthesis that can happen here. We're going to talk about that next. And so ecosystems with low NPP, like deserts, they're not going to be able to support as much animal life, and therefore they're going to have low biodiversity. Limiting factors are aspects of an ecosystem that place limitations on the amount of productivity that can occur, so therefore on the amount of NPP that can be available in the ecosystem. So there's several main limiting factors that we need to talk about. Let's just briefly go through them. The first one would be the amount of available water. The next one would be how many nutrients are available. Then we'd have to concern ourselves with how much of the year is the ecosystem above freezing. And then finally, how much light is available. So I'm going to look at each of these in turn. Why is water a limiting factor? Well, it should be pretty obvious that water is part of the photosynthesis equation. So without water, you really can't have photosynthesis. And without photosynthesis, you can't have NPP. So clearly, water is the main limiting factor. When water is limited, so is GPP, so is NPP. So a good way of thinking about this is if you have a plant in your house and you forget to water it, we all know that it dies. I mean, my wife and I have killed so many plants over the years. You think that they're dying of thirst, but really they're not. They're starving to death because the plant can't make it can't engage in photosynthesis without water, and so it ends up starving to death. So if you limit water, you limit productivity, so you end up reducing the amount of NPP available in the ecosystem. Now, nutrients are something we'll talk a lot about this year. So what is a nutrient? So basically, nutrients are chemical elements that are necessary in order to build cellular material, like proteins and nucleic acids. So the two main nutrients we'll talk about all year are, here, let me bring up my laser, are nitrogen and phosphorus. These are really important elements, and here's why. So proteins, which are built out of amino acids, all have nitrogen as part of them, right? So if you don't have nitrogen available, if it's limited, then plants can't make new cells. And if they can't make new cells, they can't grow and add NPP. So even though the plant is engaging in photosynthesis, it can't store it if it can't make new cells. Now, phosphorus is important because all organisms need RNA and DNA. So nucleic acids are important in replication and in the cells communicating through the ribosomes on what proteins need to be built. And so if you limit this phosphorus, you limit the ability, again, of cells to form. So in order for plants to grow and increase biomass, they have to have nutrients. So that everybody knows this, right? Farmers put fertilizer on plants to make them grow. That's because they can't grow if they don't have access to these elements. So let's talk about why it is that time above freezing is a limiting factor. Well, all cells, including plant cells, are mostly made out of water, and when the temperature gets below 0 C, water freezes. Well, this is a problem for cells because water expands when it freezes and it would rupture the cell. So plants have this trick where they pump water out of their cells and they increase the amount of sugar and salts, essentially turning themselves into antifreeze. If you remember from chemistry, if you studied chemistry, you probably learned about freezing point suppression. Well, they engage in that, but they can control that. What they can't control is the fact that the ground freezes. So you can't move the water out of the ground if it's frozen, so there's no photosynthesis that can occur during the times of the year where the ground is frozen. So plants that grow in areas that freeze, they have to store up their NPP during the good months, during the summer months. But in the winter months, they have no opportunity to engage in photosynthesis. They still have to live, so they have to respire. They have to eat all that food that they stored. So that greatly reduces the overall amount of NPP that they can engage in an annual basis. Now, light is also a limiting factor. That should be pretty obvious since light is part of the photosynthesis equation. You can't have NPP if you don't have light. You can't have GPP either. But here's the thing. It's not that there's places without light that have plants, but there are places that have more light than others. For instance, the tropics. If you go to the tropics, and I hope you get to do that sometimes, it's quite lovely. Basically, what you're going to find is every day is pretty much the same length. It's about 12 hours long. And so every day of the year, plants have 12 hours in which to engage in generating sugars and 12 hours in which they're going to eat them. And that results in quite a bit of leftover food. So there's a lot of NPP in the tropics, which leads to a lot of life. But at higher latitudes, like right now I currently live in Seoul, South Korea, you find that after June 21, the days start getting shorter and the nights start getting longer. And as a result, the plants that live in these latitudes, they in these months, basically between I would say June 21st and really spring, like March, they have to eat a lot of the sugars that they've stored up. So that greatly limits the amount of NPP that's available for the rest of the ecosystem. And another thing to keep in mind is in the tropics, and we'll talk about this in a different episode, the sun just shines more intensely. It's more straight down on the ground. And so the plants just get more light. Not only do they have more hours of light, they have more light per hour. So again, that results in a great deal more productivity. Hey, thanks for watching. Listen, if you found this video to be useful at all, I would appreciate if you go ahead and give it a like. If there's something you want to tell me, some kind of feedback or some video you'd like me to make, go ahead and put that in the comment section for me. Be sure to check the description below. I often post the PDF of the document that I use, also practice problems and so on that can help you do better on your AP test. And of course, you know what's coming. More than anything else, what I really need you to do is hit that subscribe button.